everyone, my name is Fritz Kenneth S. Cornelio and today I'm going to report about Chapter 1. So the first topic that I will discuss is all about a global view on prison administration.
A global view on prison administration. The extent of imprisonment worldwide cannot be determined precisely, but a broad estimate can be achieved. The opportunity to compare the figures for individual countries provides the basis of assessing the need for policy changes. The first attempt on compiling a complete list of world prison population was published in 1999. Since then, world prison population information has been traced on the extent of imprisonment in almost all countries. The estimated world prison population is now in excess of 10 million, the rate per 100,000 of the world's population. The prison population rate is around 150. The country with the highest prison population rate in the USA, with a rate of 730 per 100,000 of the national population. 15 other countries have rates over 400. By the contrast, 15 countries have the rates below 40. 10 of these are in Africa. Prison population rates vary considerably between different regions of the world and between different parts of the same continent. Imprisonment poverty. Imprisonment disproportionately affects individuals and families living in poverty. When an income-generating member of the family is imprisoned, the rest of the family must adjust to this loss of income. The impact can be especially severe in poor, developing countries where the state does not provide financial assistance to the indigent and where it is not usually for one breadwinner to financially support an extended family network. Thus, the family experiences financial losses as a result of the imprisonment of one of its members, exaggerated by the new expenses and must be met, such as cost of the lawyer, food for the imprisoned person, transport to the prison for visit, and so on. When released, often with no prospects for employment, former prisoners are generally subject to socio-economic exclusion and are thus vulnerable to an endless cycle of poverty, marginalization, criminality, and imprisonment. Thus, imprisonment contributes directly to impoverishment of the prisoner, of his family, with a significant cross-generational effect, and of society by creating future victims and reducing future potential economic performance. Public health consequences of imprisonment. Prisons have very serious health implications. Prisoners are likely to have existing health problems on entry to prison, as they are predominantly from poorly educated and socio-economically deprived sectors of the general population. With minimal access to adequate health services, their health conditions deteriorate in prisons, which is overcrowded, where nutrition is poor, sanitation inadequate, and access to fresh air and exercise are often unavailable. Psychiatric disorders such as HIV infection, tuberculosis, hepatitis B and C, sexually transmitted disease, skin disease, malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea, and injuries including self-mutilation are the main cause of morbidity and mortality in prison. In countries with a high prevalence of TB in the outside community, prevalence of TB can be up to 100 times higher inside the prisons. In most countries, HIV infections in prisons is significantly higher than within population outside prison, especially when drug addiction and risk behaviors are prevalent. Prison staff are also vulnerable to most of these diseases, of which prisoners are at risk. Prisons are not isolated from the society, and prison health is public health. The vast majority of people committed to the prison eventually return to the wider society. Thus, it is not in vain that prisoners have been referred to as reservoirs of disease in various contexts. Detrimental social impact. Imprisonment disrupts relationships and weakens social cohesion, since the maintenance of such cohesion is based on long-term relationships. When a member of a family imprisoned, and disruption of the family structure affects relationships between spouse, as well as between parents and children, reshaping the family and community across generations. Mass imprisonment produces a deep social transformation in families and communities. The cause of imprisonment. Taking into account the above considerations, it is essential to note that when considering the cause of imprisonment, accounts need to be taken not only of the not actual funds spent on the upkeep of each prisoner, which is usually significantly higher than what is spent on a prison sentenced to a non-custodial sanctions, but also of the indirect costs, such as the social, economic, and healthcare related costs, which are difficult to measure, but which are immense and long-term. The global prison crisis. A large number of prison systems around the world are not at stage of crisis. The serious effects on which harm prisoners, their families, and societies as a whole. The reality in many prisons tends to be not only far from international standards, but also risk undermining the ultimate purpose of a sentence of imprisonment. The protection of society from the crime, while the nature of the prison crisis is multidimensional, it manifests itself in the following ways: continuing growth of prison population and prison overcrowding, the severe cost of imprisonment, inadequate prison conditions, challenges meeting core functions of imprisonment, continuing growth of prison population and prison overcrowding. It is estimated that more than 10.2 million people were held in penal institutions worldwide in 2013, with an average imprisonment rate of 144 prisoners per 100,000 of the world population. In the same year, 144 national prison administrations operated on the basis of an occupancy level of over 100%. Inadequate prison conditions. Despite regional differences, prison overcrowding has developed into an acute global challenge and poses a major obstacle for the implementation of standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. Challenges meeting core functions of imprisonment. When penitentiary systems are overstretched and poorly managed, prisons run the risk of degenerating into dangerous places for both prisoners and prison staff, and can be even turned into crime schools and fertile breeding grounds for radicalization.
Poor prison conditions are in large part symptomatic and systemic deficiencies in the state criminal justice system of policy. These factors contributing to the crisis are insufficient measures to prevent crime, in particular youth crime, excessive use of pre-trial detention, lack of access to legal advice and assistance, punitive criminal justice policies, inappropriate use of imprisonment, scarce use alternatives to imprisonment, insufficient measures to promote social integration, inadequate prison management and infrastructure, detention used as a first resort of children in conflict with the law, and lastly is specific needs of women offenders and imprisonments not met.
The right mandate. Within the United Nations system, UNODC is ideally placed to assist member states in addressing the prison crisis by supporting human rights complainant, penal reform initiatives, and office supports the implementation of international standards and norms on crime prevention and criminal justice and serves as the secretariat of intergovernmental process initiated to draft or revise such standards.
The second topic is prison, antiquity to modernity.
Prison, antiquity to modernity. Our modern nations of crime and punishment are the result of millennia our human advancement from antiquity to modern times. Criminal justice and criminology have evolved due to significant contributions from a diverse array of civilizations. Here is a brief timeline of some of the most notable contributions. Summer, 3500 BC. Sumer is generally accepted as the first non-urban civilization. The ancient land of Sumer is located in modern-day Iraq. Before Sumer, people lived in small agricultural communities. Once Sumer developed, city-states appeared. This led to the formation of primitive governments. In order to control crime that naturally drives from urban life, these governing bodies began to establish the origin law of the order. Rise of the Romans, 500 BC. The Roman Republic established itself as a Western civilization's first superpower. Law and order was maintained by soldiers who would walk the streets of cities, towns, and villages. The mere presence of the soldiers was a solid deterrent, and it helped keep crime under relative control. Plato, 428 to 347 BC. As a student of Socrates, the teacher of Aristotle, Plato introduced the concept that people are inherently good. This belief greatly influenced the thoughts on crime and punishment as the centuries progressed. Aristotle, 384 to 327 BC. Expanding on the teachings of Plato, Aristotle's views relied heavily on scientific observation. As the tutor to the Alexander the Great, Aristotle would impart upon him the significance of science and its impact on decision making. These teachings had heavily influence on early forensic science and crime scene investigations. De Materia Medica, 50 to 70 AD, widely considered to be the groundwork for forensic toxicology. De Materia Medica is a publication that categorizes an area of flora written by Greek physician Phidanius Dioscorides. The book of discusses both the medical benefits and the poisonous aspect of various plants. Frank Pledge, 1035. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Western world was highly destabilized. This led to families and small communities policing themselves. After hundreds of years of no centralized policing, the English concept of plank bridge was introduced. Under this concept, males over the age of 12 were formed into groups of 10. Their job was to capture the detained members of their own clan who committed a crime. This was all done under the supervision of constable who was appointed by the crown. Summa Theologica, 1265 to 1274. Exploring the concept of natural law, Saint Thomas Aquinas wrote a Summa Theologica in furtherance of Plato's concept of people's inherent goodness. Aquinas opened the crime was both an affront to God and society, and that criminal behavior damages both the victim and the soul of the criminal. Justice of the Peace, 14th century. The English crown began appointing justice of the peace to assist constables in their efforts to control crime. These magistrates used warrants, held arraignments, and tried minor criminal cases. Social Contract, 1625 to 1762. Introduced by John Locke, the theory of the social contract discusses the various roles of people and government in maintaining a balanced society. Essentially, the theory holds that people cede authority to the government in exchange for security and prosperity. At this point in history, theories of crime and punishment shift from theological to secular. Insane asylums, 1750. The emergence of insane asylums across Europe led to the study of inmates. People were considered insane for various archaic reasons, and the people who studied them were known as alienists. The work conducted by the alienists laid the foundation of modern psychiatry. Adolf Quetelet, 1827. Using national crime statistics from France, Belgium statistician Adolf Quetelet determined that there were no correlations between demographics and crime. His studies led criminologists to understand how a person's age, gender, education, and socio-economic status could have bearing on their propensity for criminal behavior. Metropolitan Police Services, 1829. Established in London, the Metropolitan Police Services became the first full-time, professional, and uniformed police force. Each officer was issued a copy of Sir Robert Peel's Nine Principles of Policing. Prison, 1850. The concept of a modern prison first arose in Europe during the mid-19th century. Doctors were given access to the prisoners so that they could conduct studies into criminal behavior. Governments were particularly interested in the doctors' findings, as it allowed them to understand what prompts criminal behavior. As governments became stronger, the official demanded empirical evidence so that they were better equipped to control the populace. Kodak, 1888. The Kodak camera by George Eastman was a revolutionary piece of equipment on numerous levels, including its impact on policing. As a result of the easily available Kodak cameras, investigators could now memorialize crime scenes. Crime Lab, 1910. The father of forensics, Dr. Edmond Locard, established the first modern crime lab in Lyon, France. DNA evidence, 1988. For the first time ever, DNA evidence was used in criminal court. As a result of DNA evidence, Tommy Lee Andrews was found guilty of rape in Florida courtroom. Since 1988, there have been many significant advancements regarding both the manner in which crimes are investigated, as well as the methods of convicting and punishing the offenders. Not only do our modern advancements help convict wrongdoers, but they also assist as an exonerating and wrongly accused.
The third topic is all about the influence of the Roman Catholic.
The influence of the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church has influenced history more than any other organization. It exercised its power throughout the middle class. Missionaries traveled to other continents to spread Catholicism. Great architects created churches and cathedrals. Architects drew paintings and made frescoes. The Roman Church had a large influence on life during Middle Ages. It was the center of every village and town. Daily life. To become a king, vassal, or knight, you went through a religious ceremony. Holidays were in honor of saints or religious events. On Fridays, people did not eat meat. On Sundays, the people went to Mass. Church leaders ran schools and hospitals. Monks and nuns provided food and shelter for the travelers. Priests recorded births, married people, and performed burial services. Political life. Political life, the church played a role in politics. Church officials, kings, and nobles governed Western Europe. Church leaders were also lords and vassals. Church leaders advised the king. They kept records, as some kings could not read or write. Local nobles chose the parish priest. The parish priest told the people to respect the king, nobles, and other government officials. The people were told to obey the king's law unless they went against church laws. People who disobeyed the pope or church law lost their membership in the church. They would also lose their political rights. Inmates practiced their religion on an individual basis or within the structure of an organized religious program. Religious programs are commonplace in jails and prisons, and research indicates that 1 in 3 inmates participates in some religious program during their incarceration. Moral and religious influence, religion and crime, shame penalties, religion in prisons, prison chaplains, practicing religion in prison. The influence of religion in morality on criminal justice has been a major importance throughout history. Morality is society's set of accepted rules and norms of behavior. Morality is commonly part of religious belief. A primary role of religion is to exert control over its followers by setting and promoting rules and customs for people to follow. In turn, these rules help establish criminal laws in a government's justice system. The role of religion in defining crimes in America's colonial society of the 17th and 18th centuries was clear. Key crimes included blasphemy, showing a lack of reverence towards God, sexual deviance, and heresy, holding a belief that conflicts with church doctrine. Early punishments focus on shame and guilt as ways of bringing those who stayed back into the fold. This shame and guilt were supposed to make the offender apologize, ask forgiveness, and live a better life. Why do prisoners turn to religion? Studies have shown that one of the reasons inmates become involved in religion is to improve their self concept. Many inmates experience guilt, remorse, and pain as a result of their criminal history and background. Religion helps them to feel better about themselves and thus improve their self concept in this way.
The fourth topic is all about Pope John Paul II, the pro-life.
John Paul II, the pro-life. John Paul II, a beloved pope and inspirational religious leader who was a pro-life hero, will be canonized as saint on Sunday, April 27th. We pause to reflect on the pro-life messages of this soon-to-be saint, who as Pope spoke with steadfast faith and inextinguishable commitment to human dignity for all. A Pope who acted with peerless courage and conviction in the face of extreme animosity and danger to help bring freedom and democracy to his Polish homeland and eventually all of Eastern and Central Europe, bringing about the demise of the Soviet Union. His travels to over 129 countries earned him the title of the Pilgrim Pope and won the hearts of a billion as he called upon the faithful to advance a culture of life. For pro-life lawmakers and for those working to protect unborn children and their mothers from the violence of abortion, John Paul II, defining of this global struggle as the culture of life versus the culture of death, epitomized the battle clearly and succinctly renewed the pro-life movement with a clear vision of what it was working for and not just against, and motivated a new generation to stand up for the most vulnerable. Bless John Paul II's courage, charisma, and unwavering convictions were and are the stuff that makes heroes. He was the remain a pro-life hero who soon will be canonized as a saint. John Paul II innately understood the darkness of the struggle for the right to life for children in the womb. After all, he had endured years in the midst of the evil and darkness that had enveloped his beloved Poland, never giving in or giving up resistance as he could until the day freedom was won. We need to do the same thing in pro-life movement. Saint John Paul II, in his 1995 encyclical letter, The Gospel of Life, wrote of his alarm at the extraordinary increase and gravity of threats to the life of individuals and peoples, but said on sight of hope was the increasing opposition around the world to capital punishment. Pope John Paul had the Catechism of the Catholic Church revised to strengthen its anti-death penalty posture. The text now says that giving the means of the state's disposal to efficiently repress crime by rendering and offensive the one who has committed it, without depriving him deficiently of the possibility of redeeming himself. Cases of absolute necessity for superprehension of the offender today are very rare, if not particularly non-existent. Pope Francis cannot change the law of individual countries because that's the competence of legislators, Father Docock said, but he can commonly encourage respect for the sacredness of human life, because the death penalty truly is not necessarily, because security and justice can be served without capital punishment. He said, the urgent matter today is to demonstrate respect for the sacredness of every human life, even the life of public criminals responsible for the death of others.
The fifth topic is all about the Walnut Street Jail.
Walnut Street Jail. The Walnut Street Prison was a pioneering effort in prison reform, originally built as a conventional jail just before the American Revolution. It was expanded in 1790 and hailed as a model of enlightened thinking about criminals. The prison, in fact, was known as a penitentiary from the Latin word for remorse. It was designed to provide a severe environment that left inmates much time for reflection. But it was also designed to be cleaner and safer than the past prisons. The Walnut Street prison was one of the foremost of an entire school of thought on prison construction and the prison was built on Walnut Street in Philadelphia as a city jail in 1773 to alleviate overcrowding in the existing city jail. Although designed by Robert Smith, Pennsylvania's most prominent architect, the building was a typical U-shaped building designed to hold groups of prisoners in large rooms. By and large, the role of prisoners was to incarcerate criminals. There was a little regard for their physical well-being, nor were there any attempts to rehabilitate them. Prisoners were overcrowded and dirty, and inmates attacked each other regularly. Those who served their sentence came out of prison probably more inclined toward a criminal life than they were before in their incarceration. It was the Quakers of Philadelphia who came up with the concept for what they called the penitentiary, a place where prisoners could reflect on their crime and become truly sorry for what they had done. The Quakers believed that through reflection and repentance, inmates would give up crime and leave prison rehabilitated. Shortly after the American Revolution, a group of Quakers formed the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, whose goal was made clear in its name. Later, the group became known as the Pennsylvanian Prison Society. In the years after the Revolution, this group worked to encourage prison reform, and its efforts finally paid off in 1790 when the Walnut Street Jail became the first state penitentiary in the country. The main addition to the Walnut Street complex was a new cell block called the Penitentiary House, built in the courtyard of the existing structure. It included a series of small cells designed to hold individual prisoners. The cells of the corridors connecting them were designed to prevent prisoners from communicating with each other. Windows were high up. The cells had 9-foot high ceilings and grated and lowered to prevent prisoners from looking onto the street. Each cell had a mattress, a water tap, and a privy pipe. Inmates were confined to their cells for the duration of their confinement. The only person they saw was a guard, and then only briefly once a day. They were sometimes allowed to read in their cells, but for the most part they sat in solitude. The Quakers saw this solitary confinement not as a punishment, but a time for reflection and remorse. That was the reason the inmates were not put to work. Labor, said penitentiary proponents, would preoccupy the inmates and keep them from reflecting on the Walnut Street prison became in part of the model for what became known as the Pennsylvanian system of prison design and philosophy. Other prisons built on the Pennsylvanian model include a prison in Pittsburgh in 1821, the Eastern State Penitentiary, Cherry Hill, in Eastern Philadelphia in 1836, and the Trenton State Prison in New Jersey the same year. The concepts of solitary confinement and repentance were key components of prison life at these institutions, although some Pennsylvanian system prison did introduce labor to the inmates. Visitors from overseas who were interested in prison reform visited Walnut Street, Eastern State, and similar prisons to see how they operated and to gain knowledge about prison reform strategies. Meanwhile, in 1821, A prison was opened in the small upstate New York town of Auburn. The prison, which relied on individual cell block architecture, required inmates to work 10 hours per day, 6 days per week. A number of prison reforms believe that by making the inmates work in an atmosphere free of corruption of criminal behavior, they would build new sets of values. The work would rehabilitate them because it would give them a sense of purpose, discipline, and order. This system became known as the Auburn system, and it was followed in 1826 with the opening of Sing Sing Prison on the banks of the Hudson River. Soon, it was clear that the Auburn system worked better at rehabilitating prisoners and then the Pennsylvania system. And in the next century, the Auburn system became the dominant one. Many prisons built to operate under the Pennsylvania system switched onto the Auburn system. Vestige of the Pennsylvania system exists in the philosophy of humane punishment. Although no prison in the U.S. as of 2003 could place anyone in near total isolation except in extreme circumstances. As for Walnut Street, its success was short-lived. Despite the good intentions of Quakers, the particular matter of housing prisoners became more pressing than the desire among prison officials to rehabilitate the inmates. Walnut Street became overcrowded and dirty, and there was no sign that isolated prisoners were being rehabilitated through solitude. By the 1830s, the prison had outlived its usefulness and it was closed in 1835. Later, it was razed and a library now stands on the site. Walnut Street Jail started in 1790 in Pennsylvania system, became overcrowded because of increased industries and sites, reduced crime rate of 131 to 45 in 1796, reduced escapes to zero in first 4 years. It was converted to a prison by Quakers. The study of the Bible was the primary method. Their goal was to provide religion and humanity to imprisoned offenders held in solitary confinement. Quakers passed the first law that offenders are not to be reformed by treatment and discipline, opened First Penitentiary in a wing of Philadelphia's Walnut Street Jail in 1790. Enforced silence and hard labor would cause repentance. Solitary rooms with constant menial chores, overcrowding, and lack of work for dead major change in the system.
1970 law passed by the Pennsylvania legislature. These are the reforms of Walnut Street Jail. First is humane physical facilities, adequate food and water at public expense, separation of men, women, and children, prohibited buying better treatment, debtors and the mentally ill separated from the criminal population. Orphans were moved to separate buildings. Prisoners worked but were paid off for labor, earned early release for good behavior. Attempt to rehabilitate prisoners became overcrowded. Conditions deteriorated and costs skyrocketed. Prisons failed at rehabilitation. These are the problem with the system. First is solitary confinement caused nervous breakdown and suicide. Second, they thought silence would cause the prisoners to not pick each other's bad attitudes. The sixth topic is all about King Henry VIII.
King Henry VIII. He was born on June 28, 1491, to King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. He was the sixth child of King Henry and Elizabeth. Of the six children, only his older brother Arthur and sister Margaret and Mary made it out of infancy. At age 15, his older brother Arthur died. This thrust all the duties and responsibilities of becoming the new heir to the Henry. Henry was even arranged to marry his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. This was done to keep the political alliance between England and Spain. Henry was raised to be pious and devout Catholic. He was awarded the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope after writing the treatise denouncing Martin Luther's reformist ideas Christian. Henry was considered a Renaissance man. Henry was also known as Have Many Wives. He was an accomplished musician, author, and poet. He also excelled at sports, especially jousting and hunting. He also loved gambling, playing dice, and cockfighting as well as being a strong, dedicated of Christian. Henry did not enjoy his father's stoic and unexciting ruling style, instead favoring exciting court life. The court life initiated by his father involved into a cornerstone of Tudor government in the reign of Henry VIII. Henry loved the extravagance and excitement of the court drama. He spent much of his time being entertained by the nobles and met the last five of his wives from his court. King Henry VIII is famous for his brutal treatment toward his whole family members, including his wives and children. For example, loyal Catherine of Aragon was divorced by force, and Henry decided to execute Anne Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon for the sake of having a boy who can inherit his throne. His children were also famous for being omnipotent, including Queen Mary Tudor, Queen Elizabeth I, and King Edward VI, who continued the Tudor generations. Despite these brutal actions, Henry was able to accomplish many goals in various areas such as religion, politics, military, and of course personal achievements. Religious accomplishments of King Henry VIII. During his early years, Henry VIII wrote the book called The Declaration of the Seven Sacraments against Martin Luther with Sir Thomas More in 1520. In 1521, Henry VIII was awarded with the title Defender of the Faith by Pope Leo X, which was used as English monarch title until now. Established the Church of England in 1534 and the Act of Supremacy, gaining omnipotent power, started the dissolution of the monasteries in 1536 and increased the wealth of England. Military accomplishments of King Henry VIII. Henry VIII started the biggest invasions of France. Thanks to Henry's great success, the Mary Rose was built between 1509 and 1511 as the first English gunship. Henry VIII established Woolwich and Deptford as the royal dockyards between 1511 and 1512. The continuous success in military earned King Henry VIII the title Father of English Navy. Henry VIII created a great numbers of coastal fortresses in the 1540s to defend England against the invasion. Renewed warfare with France and Scotland in 1542. French armies who landed on the English coast between 1545 and 1546 were defeated. Political accomplishments of King Henry VIII. King Henry VIII replaced the feudal concepts with imperial concepts. Due to Henry VIII's dislike of great of power of the nobles, he increased the power of parliament and the monarchy for himself. Dissolution of the monasteries caused Henry to create new lands and positions. The Act of Appeals in 1533 was passed to aid the constitutional development. Henry's establishment of the Parliament led to the Union of England and Wales in 1536 and 1543. He was granted the title King of Ireland by the Irish Parliament in 1541. Henry VIII entered politically advantageous marriages with Spain and Germany. Was King Henry VIII a good military leader? When Henry VIII became King of England in 1509, he inherited a nation that was not strong in war. England's recent war had mostly been internal in the form of the Wars of the Roses. Emerging as the victor from these wars, his father Henry VII had been concerned with consolidating his new Tudor dynasty, not flexing its military might. As a result of these factors, the Englands had not been placed under pressure to keep up with military advances on the continent. Their reputation with Henry VIII took the throne what was that of brave soldiers in a backward army. Henry VIII was a proud, passionate, and military-minded ruler, determined to see England become a major player on the European stage. He brought about the military reforms needed to create a modern fighting force. Reviving military nobility. Henry VII had ensured that his nobles still took some interest in the arts of war, encouraging a cult of chivalry and hosting tournaments in which his son was a leading light. But it was the younger Henry who, filled with the fighting spirit these tournaments had fostered, sought to revive a real interest in war. For a Renaissance kingdom, the nobility were still the natural leaders of any army, men with the time and resources to become experts in combat and strategy, and nations-born leaders. Henry VIII encouraged his nobles to aspire to military leadership, favoring men who sought glory in war or did well in tournaments, such as the Duke of Suffolk, knowing that political advancement was now tied to material prowess. Nobles turned themselves with growing enthusiasm to the skills of the battlefield. Foreign mercenaries. To make up for the lack of experience in his country, Henry VIII made expensive uses of foreign mercenaries to fill specialist roles. A quarter of the troops he fielded in an army of 1,544 were foreigners. The mercenaries had a ranged skill. Some were hand gunners, using the increasingly popular gunpowder infantry weapons. Some were Landsknechts, famed German pikemen. There were heavily cavalry, mounted gunners with pistols and arquebuses, and even Stardioti, light skirmishers from the Balkans. These soldiers created a professional corps to the army and acted as an example to less experienced English troops. More handguns. One of the main reasons for recruiting mercenaries was the growing importance of gunpowder weapons. England had clung to the power of the long bow, but as that became increasingly obsolete, new technology had to be adopted. Guns were imported, and the native manufacturing industries encouraged mercenaries served not only to carry this weapon but also to train English soldiers in their use. Of the 44,000 men Henry fielded in 1544, only 10% were equipped with gunpowder weapons. With every campaign that passed, the number grew. Artillery. Embracing technology also meant investing in artillery. something Henry did not with enthusiasm. He imported over 100 cannons from the continent, including the famous great bronze gun called the 12 Apostles, manufactured at the Malines foundries near Antwerp. Such guns were vital to 16th century warfare. They could be developed on the battlefield, but more importantly, were used to bombard enemies' fortifications, cracking open coastals and town walls. To ensure the long-term health of the English artillery train, Henry encouraged the creation of homegrown cannon-founding industry. Craftsmen came from abroad to produce English cannons, and Enlightenment in turn learned the skills from them. By the end of Henry's reign, both bronze and cast iron cannons were being produced in England. The fleet. As an island nation, England was reliant upon its navy, both of defense and to project its power abroad. Henry sought to bolster the navy through a program of shipbuilding, enlarging the English fleet. While this was successful and generally, it led to one of the most famous and tragic accidents in English naval history. In 1545, the Mary Rose, Henry's much celebrated flagship, kneeled over the sunk of its way out to sea. There were many trapped men on board, and they drowned. That the disaster happened in front of the King Henry and his ashamed army added to the humiliation. Tragic as it was, the accident was proven a happy one of the archaeologists, as the 20th century retrieval of the Mary Rose allowed great insights to be gained into Tudor warfare. Coastal forts. The navy was not the only contribution Henry made to England's naval defense. Using money taken from the abolished monasteries and even some of the materials which with they had been built, he created a string of fortresses all along England's southern shores, reaching halfway up the country on the each coast. Though they did not use all the latest techniques such as angled bastions, these fortifications incorporated many recent development such as rounded bastions and tier of guns in concentric circles. Military careers. A side effect of all these developments was that it became much easier to have a military career in England. With an expanded fleet, more standing forces, more regular armies, and more efforts to be garrisoned, it became possible to build a career of military service in a way that could not be done before. More opportunities for service meant that more men developed military skills, making it easier to assemble compliant armies. A virtuous cycle of military improvement had begun.
The seventh topic is all about King Edward VI, a jewel of King Henry VIII.
King Edward VI, a jewel of King Henry VIII. King Edward VI took the throne at the age of 10 and was too young to marry. He was the first English monarch to be raised in the Anglican Church. Edward enlisted in the help of Thomas Cranmer, created the English Book of Canon Prayer, Anglican Prayers, made the Anglican Church more Protestant in its tradition and belief. History portrays Edward VI as the fable of ultimately doomed son of Henry VIII, but the truth is too much darker than that. Far from weakling, even as a boy, Edward proved nearly as twisted as his ruthless father, and his gruesome end was likely a blessing of England. Facts about Edward VI. he was beautiful. The birth of Edward VI was probably the greatest moment of Henry VIII's life. The returned king desperately wanted a son, but it took 28 years, two daughters, and three wives to finally make it happen. To say people were excited would be an understatement. One chronicler described the infant Edward was the most beautiful boy that ever was seen. However, England couldn't celebrate for long. Tragedy soon marred the joyous occasion. He never knew his mother. Queen Jane Seymour couldn't take part in the celebrations along with everyone else. It soon became clear that the birth had taken in a serious toll on her. Within days, she was hanging by a thread. Seymour fought for a little over a week before succumbing to her illness. Edward VI never got to meet his mother, and let's just say the boy definitely needed all the motherly guidance he couldn't get. His father abandoned him. Edward VI grew up without a mother, but here's the thing, he basically grew up without a father too. Sure, Henry VIII was over the moon that he finally had a son. That doesn't mean he was actually going to spend any time with the boy. God forbid Henry sent Edward away pretty much from the moment he was born. And aside from the one brief visit when Edward was one, he almost never saw the boy for the first several years of his life. And that means that Henry wasn't there to support Edward as the boy was fighting for his life. He caught a sudden fever. Most reports claim that Edward VI was a hale and healthy child, but that could have just been people trying to avoid Henry VIII's wrath for giving him bad news about his boy. Either way, there's one thing we know for sure. When Edward was 4, he caught the deadly quartan fever. I'm sure all of England held their breath. Who knows how darky Henry VIII would get if the son he'd waited so many years for suddenly passed. But in the end, Edward recovered and got to grow up to become one of the biggest spoiled brats that world have ever seen. He was the most spoiled. Sure, Henry didn't actually spend any time around Edward, but he still spoiled the heck out of the kid. He called his son this whole realm most precious jewel, and had his attendants treat him accordingly. Edward's apartments had to be kept spotless at all times. They had insane levels of security, and of course, they include all the finest toys and luxuries money could buy. Edward even had his own personal mental troupe for carrying out loud. Now I know what you're thinking. Spoiling a kid rotten rarely turns out well. Edward was no different. The boy was quickly growing into a little terror. His whole life changed overnight. Edward VI's entire life changed when he turned 6. Why? Because, believe it or not, the Tudors believed that a child became an adult at age 6. That meant that Edward finally got to move into his acts up happy father, and their relationship quickly took a turn for a weird. He took fancy to another level. Gave the Tudors credit for one thing, they really knew how to spoil a kid. Sure, Henry made Edward study like any other boy, but he made sure his son studied in style. Edward's school books were completely covered in gold and set with sapphires, rubies, and diamonds. I guess Henry VIII had never heard the plea, don't judge a book by its cover. And when Edward took lunch breaks, he ate with jewel-encrusted cutlery and napkins threaded with pure gold and silver thread. Yeah, calling Edward sport doesn't quite cover it. And like a lot of rich kids, Edward got up some disturbing hobbies. He softened his father. Give Edward VI credit for one thing. He was the only person on earth who seemed capable of making Henry VIII act like a decent human being. Henry had long since disinherited both of his daughters and divorced beheaded their moms. But having a son softened him. In 1543, he invited all three of his kids to spend Christmas with him. For most families, that seems pretty normal, but for Tudors, it was completely unheard of. Life in the Tudor family seemed downright normal for maybe the first time ever, but of course, it couldn't last long. He got engaged at 5 years old. The pleasant Christmas dinner took place at the high point in Henry's eighth life. Not only was his son everything he'd dreamed of, but Edward had even solved of Henry's biggest problems. Henry brokered a deal with Scotland of Edward to marry the 7-month-old Mary Queen of Scots. With that deal, Henry set himself up to finally get Scotland under English ruler after centuries of conflict. A son in Scotland, it seemed like nothing could go wrong of Henry VIII, so, of course, that's when everything went wrong. He wasn't ready to be king. Whether or not anyone thought Edward would make a good king doesn't change the fact Henry VIII kicked the bucket in 1547. The 9-year-old Edward became king. After the absolute circus of Henry's reign, no doubt the people of England hoped they might finally get to take a breath. No, Edward's reign would be just as chaotic as his dad's, but don't worry, it would be a cut short before Edward could do some much damage. He was a child tyrant. Even as a boy, Edward VI had a cruel streak. He was his father's son. After all, remember how Henry made sure to brainwash Edward in a new Church of England. Well, by the time he became king, Edward was a full-on fanatic, and he was spent most of his time rewriting England's law so that Catholics were heavily oppressed. If he'd lived longer, who knows how brutal life for English Catholics would have become. But while keeping Catholics down was high on Edward's to-do list, he couldn't do everything himself. He had advisors to do most of the ruling for him, but these men were as power-hungry and heartless as his father was.